everyone. Thanks for joining. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm also looking at the chat, so I should be able to see if you have questions. Awesome. Yeah, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. So I'm not really sure what everyone's familiarity is with Beam. Today we're going to be talking about a new-ish feature called custom containers, where it's basically more about the pipeline execution rather than how to build a pipeline in Beam. And so this is a new feature for providing your own SDK harness container image in a portable pipeline. Maybe that's just words to you that mean nothing, but hopefully I'll explain what that means, and then you'll know how to do it. I'll also be giving this talk as well at Beam College, where I assume we'll be talking a little more about the basics of Beam. So if you're interested in that, you should definitely attend that. So a quick overview just of Beam in general and the portability framework. What are we talking about when we say a portable pipeline? Beam has this vision of you can write a pipeline in any sort of language, whether that's Java, Python, Go, etc. Beam takes it and translates that pipeline into a format that any runner can understand and run on their execution engine or runner. And so that's actually the orchestration of the running of your pipeline. So basically spinning up workers and splitting up the work in a way that makes it efficient to run this pipeline. And so at your side, you write your code in your language, and the runner at some point does need to know how to run things in your language because you've probably written custom code or things like that in your pipeline. That's sort of the beauty of Beam. And so in this talk, we'll be talking a little bit more about like pipeline execution. So to give an overview of what that looks like in a portable pipeline, you've basically downloaded the SDK in a language, whether that's, we'll be talking mostly about Python because that's sort of where our subpart is focusing on right now for custom containers. So you download your Python SDK, and you write a pipeline, and it maybe looks something like this. There are building blocks that Beam provides that you can use to construct your pipeline. You submit it using the SDK to the Beam job service, which then hands it off to whatever runner you've chosen. And the runner itself manages the details of splitting up your work and handing it off to workers, spinning up how many workers you may need in a very fully managed way, like with Cloud Data Flow. This is all automatic, and you spin up VMs with the other runners like Flink or Spark. There might be a little bit more management, or you're using maybe like a cluster server in order to manage like workers underneath the surface. But yeah, at the crux of it is these workers in a distributed, for very simple pipelines, you wouldn't need to have more than one worker, but maybe for a larger pipeline, you have many workers. And so whatever is doing the actual pipeline work will at some point need to know how to run whatever is in your language. And so they spin up what's called an SDK harness, which basically just is a way for whatever is running the worker, to run your user code. And so this SDK harness process needs to know how to do that. And so by default, this is a containerized process. So that's why we call it an SDK harness container or an SDK harness container image when we are packaging the base image that creates the container. And so we do that using Docker. We have this concept of the container contract in Beam for Fun API that is basically saying this is like what we expect the SDK harness to be able to do and what it needs to do, and how it interacts with the runner and the worker. And so this process is typically run as a container because it's an easy way to package up your code and dependencies. In order to run your language, it needs, the language, the SDK itself, and then any sort of dependencies that your code relies on. And so ideally, this is run in an isolated hermetic environment. And so to some people, that might mean container, maybe not. But it can be spun up in many different ways. If you've ever run like the loopback environment or things like that, that's sort of like a different way to run the SDK harness, where it's just running locally on your machine and using your dependencies on your machine. And so that makes it very easy to test things locally. But it's not ideal for remote runners, where you don't have access to the machine, so you can't install things. And so we actually release default SDK harness images through Beam releases. So here's an example of like a Python one. You can see 2.28 was just released. We are also cloning these to GCR, and we will generally be maintaining these going forward. The GCR clones were sort of recent, so you might not see some backwards, but that's sort of to skirt around something we'll talk about a little bit later, potential quota limits with Docker Hub. And so these images contain basic requirements, which is basically, it has the SDK and it has the dependencies of the base SDK. And sometimes it includes a little bit more, like for example, for the Python images, we actually include TensorFlow because that's such a common library, and rather than having you download a very large library on the fly, we sort of just packaged it in, but it is like locked to a specific version. And so you can understand sort of why with remote runners, we have limited ways to configure more dependencies. Typically with Python, this is more of a problem. Java obviously has things like Uber jars, where you just package everything and then you run it. And so Python has a bunch of different ways, like requirements files and setup files and all this stuff, to basically reuse setup tools and PyPy to install all of the things that you might need to do on a machine before you actually run the SDK or run your user code. And so rather than sort of continue to expand on how many different pipeline options we can offer in order to do this, we decided with the portable pipeline, or with the portability framework, containerizing the SDK harness allows us to do something called basically custom containers. And so this is basically, you can build your own container image. You can do whatever you want. You can stage large files or large dependencies, or just like your own files that you don't want to put somewhere remote. You can run arbitrary setup scripts or your own processes if you want to run some package of your own before, and it can be any language as long as it's on the image. And so you can set environment variables. So not that I would recommend this, but you can set credentials in environment variables, or you can set various, libraries have environment variables that they rely on, like cert passes or things like that, or server values, things like that, server URLs. And so ideally, you build this container image and then you provide it as a pipeline option. And so this is technically already supported for most of the Beam portable runners. And so that includes things like Flink Runner and Spark Runner. Dataflow just recently added what we call preview access, which is like, it's not alpha access, so you don't have to like request whitelisting or anything for that. But it is sort of like a pre-stage before GA. We just want to see what you guys are up to with custom containers, and if you break everything. Hopefully you don't. Yeah, and this is currently only supported with Python portable pipelines because of how the portable pipelines allow for the containerization of the SDK harness itself. And so this is like controlled by the use runner v2 flag for the most part. We are only limiting it to Python, obviously, because Python is like where this is the biggest issue. Yeah, and so the rest of this talk will be basically discussing how you do this. Yeah, so how do we build this image? Well, I don't want to go into too much detail about how to build a Docker file or build a Docker image. I'm sure that if you have been working at all in the cloud space, there is exhaustive information there about containers and images and all this stuff. And so, a great place to start is definitely the Docker documentation itself. And so the ways in which we basically recommend are sort of you base it off an existing container image. So we have the default container images that we've released for the SDK harness on Docker Hub or on GCR, as we mentioned. And so basically just using it as your from statement in a Docker file. For the most part, I'll be talking about building with Docker, just because that's, the canonical way. If you want to do something non-Docker, by all means, it's pretty similar. I think most container image building processes are very similar. Yeah, but with this, you can just do whatever you can with Dockerfile or Docker build syntax, and then you just run Docker build, my image, Dockerfile, etc. And so I think this is pretty straightforward. I'll go a little over like different things you can do maybe in the demo a little bit later. A sort of variant of this, say if you don't, if there's something about the base image that you want to change, is basically using multi-stage builds. This is also on the Docker documentation. I did not put a link on the slide, but I will later. But basically, you can use multiple images sort of to, so say you already have a base image. So this is my base image, and you can run to install the SDK on it, and then you can copy over the dependencies from the actual SDK image. I don't know why I switched Python versions for this particular step, but eventually, sort of like the essential parts of it are kind of listed here, where it's you have the SDK, you have the dependencies, the base dependencies required to run the Beam SDK, and then you set the entry point so that it actually launches the worker process or the SDK harness process, whatever you want to call it, which actually knows how to do the Beam things. And so this is a Go script that we release, or a Go binary that we release. So it will work for any of the AMD 64 architecture kind of things. So if you want to do even more customization, these are sort of like the recommended ways to do things where you're not like building things too intensely by yourself. The final sort of option is from source, which obviously is like the last resort, where you check out a stable branch of Beam, you edit the Docker files. We build things from Docker files, so you can obviously go into Beam and like even just look at it to see what we sort of package into the Docker file. I do see a little comment. It is, yes, it's very big, and I'll actually sort of like discuss that a little bit later. But sort of the multi-stage image actually then allows you to package, things a little differently, I think, in that sense. You can just kind of pick and choose what you want rather than trying to copy in everything. The other option, obviously, is like maybe you have to have a specific OS, or you have to have a specific sort of way of building it, or you just want to rebuild the Go binary for your specific OS, things like that. This is sort of your option here. This is what we recommended for a while before we officially supported custom containers. But if you haven't worked on Beam before, the setup, like we're trying to improve the setup process for contributing and things like that, but it can be a little bit difficult, especially because there are so many languages supported, and just setting up any sort of development environment is difficult. We are trying to containerize it, I believe, but basically to like give you a container that you can develop in. But I mean, in general, I think that the first two options are better for you. So the important bits to move on is basically that you have the language. So the base images are based off like a base Python image. So they have the Python distribution and sort of you have pip installed and things like that. You have the SDK requirements, which are just the basic SDK requirements to actually build and run the SDK. And then you have the boot script, which we build from Go scripts. And so these are sort of static binaries that manage things in the Fun API, it's called, and then launching the SDK worker process. So now that we've sort of gone over how to build this image, let's go over how you use them. And so the sort of prerequisites before we do this is because we actually use Docker as like the container runtime for Beam in general. It is a sort of requirement that your runner or your worker can run Docker. And so with Dataflow, this is all managed by Dataflow itself, so you don't need to do this, but for things like Fling and Spark, you will need to make sure that whatever you are running your workers on have Docker installed. And so if you're running it locally, you just need to make sure that the image is loaded or loadable in your Docker daemon. And so what this means is if you have private images, you need to make sure that your local Docker credentials can handle it. Although in general, it's better to have public images or images that you sort of have implicit credentials for. For remote workers, we still pull it through Docker, so it's the same path. Obviously, cloud providers have their own way of both providing container registries, for example, GCR or GAR for Google, and so these are mostly done through like Cloud IAM. AWS obviously has their own, and essentially those are sort of your only options unless you're managing your worker yourself, and somehow this is like something that you can't really customize just because this is before your container has been spun up. This is actually to spin up your container or to pull your container. And so if you feel strongly that you need other credentials, you should definitely let us know. I do believe I've seen, I think, a couple of feature requests flying around, but I'm not really sure what the state of them are. So if you feel strongly, you should jump in, jump in the comments. But yeah, so this is sort of like beforehand, you just want to make sure that you can pull your image. So even just, running Docker pull from a different machine or things like that will help you with that. And so primarily I'll be actually talking about the Dataflow runner, just both because I work at Google and so this is what I'm most familiar with, but also I think this is like where custom containers have a lot of benefit is in the sort of you aren't managing your workers. And so this obviously does apply to other runners and things like that. But to actually show you what it looks like running on a remote worker and things like that is easiest through Dataflow Runner, where I have a UI to show you nice things. And so in this example, we are just running word count. And so this is pretty typical, but as you can see at the end, there are two different flags. One is experiment use runner v2, which is basically saying I want to run a portable pipeline, and the other one is a worker harness container image, which is, you know, just the image that you've built, and you provide this URL. So this one would obviously pull from Docker Hub. I'll mostly be using GCR. Again, I work at Google. But you know, this is all your personal preference. And so as long as the prerequisite is fulfilled, use whatever you want. And so you can also test it locally. And so this is sort of actually what we call like a portable environment. And so this is like reused for any of the runners that support a portable environment. And this is how we actually support custom containers, is through this portable environment. And so basically you provide an environment type to Docker to basically say, I want to run the FTK harness as a Docker container. And so the environment config, then you provide the URL. There are a couple where this is potentially backward going to be supported in the future still, but will be maybe, there is some work to make this like a little more clear, because there are a lot of options for environment type. People like the runner supporters are sort of having alternative flags. So definitely make sure to read the documentation, because that'll be definitely the most up-to-date flag that you should use. And so this is pretty similar. The Flink Spark, or just any runner that runs a portable environment and supports the portable environment flags, will use the same thing. I should note that because we are running in a container runtime right now, for anything that runs sort of locally, when you, for example, use Flink Runner like this, it spins up a Flink server locally. This will actually assume that the input and output are on your container itself. And this is sort of like maybe a pain point that we are looking to fix, but basically adding mounts. This is more of like a portable environment thing rather than a custom container only specific thing. But just as a note, if you need to persist the container, or if you need to persist the input and output, you should definitely use a remote file system that your workers can access. Awesome. So yeah, I'll go ahead and give the demo. I, for some reason, was not allowed to copy this link into the chat, but let me try again. Oh, let's not do that. Oh, okay, now it works. Great. And so this might move, because I'm giving this talk at Beam College, we might be moving all of this code into like a shared repository for that purpose. But just for today, sort of, if you want to look at what I'm going to be doing, I wrote some very potentially stupid scripts to demo some stuff today. But if you just want to follow along, feel free to. Yeah, so I'll just sort of go over what this looks like. Is the text visible on the shared screen? Do you want me to make anything bigger, smaller? That should hopefully be good. Awesome, cool. Sweet. So just an overview of like what this contains. It's basically I have my Docker file where I'm going to build an image. I'm going to have my demo POI, which is really just word count, but it's special word count. And I have a custom package that I've created called Sparkles, which does some stuff. But this is basically representing any sort of third-party package or your own code that you want to package. And typically you would have to either make it available publicly or do some setup and sort of kind of stage your package tarball or however you distribute it locally, and then do some things with pipeline options to get it to work. And so rather than have all of that, basically we're just going to package it all into a container. We're going to run a data flow job with it, and then profit. I don't know. Yeah. So go ahead and start, just to go over like what this looks like. I've set up a couple of args just for my own sake. Ooh, that one's not used anymore. Delete. I have a Beam version, and I'm saying I'm going to be building from the Apache Beam version. I already have it downloaded, as we said. It's very large. This is pretty much actually because we package all of the dependencies we need or that are commonly used right now into the image itself. And perhaps we will change that in the future now that custom containers is supported. I set an environment variable for a demo header, which I'll sort of go over a little bit later. I have an input file. This is actually only really used for local running, and I'll show that if I have time. And then I added my package that I've created locally, and then I installed some things. So my package actually uses GMPY2, which is sort of a C library that does some number things. Sparkles will do some prime number testing. So that's sort of like to represent whatever wacky package that you want to install using pip or things like that. Perhaps it's a very large package and you don't want to download this or install it every time you spin up a new worker or things like that. And then, so it installs that and then installs my custom package. Perhaps this is proprietary Sparkles and you don't want to reveal it to everyone. Yeah, cool. And then my demo is just word count. I do a little bit of specific stuff. The primary things here are I have like an output where I've added Sparkles to it. I also log it. You'll see why if we get to, or for local running, because the container immediately finishes, we don't actually have access to the container afterwards. Basically logging it is how we might debug things locally. Yeah, and so for Sparkle itself, basically I have a sink and a very, very simple module. Obviously, when you are doing this yourself, you might have something very large or complicated instead. But mine is just, adding some sparkles to words given a specific number. So we'll have one sparkle if it's a word that's only used once. We'll have different sparkles if it's a prime number of uses. And then this sink is really just a copied version of the sink that we already use if you use write to text or things like that. But I wanted to change the MIME type so it would display nicely in GCS. That's all. But it also has, it looks for environment variable called demo header and adds it to the top of any of the outputs. And so this is sort of to represent any sort of user code which calls upon an environment variable set upon the worker. And so this just represents that. Obviously, you will probably not be doing the exact same thing that I'm doing, but yeah, cool. So now that we have that, I have this demo script set up. I'm actually going to be using my hard-coded script, which is not included. But basically, I've set a bunch of variables at the top. I have some specific setups that I've already done, and I'm not going to do again because that would take too much time. So I installed all of the Apache Beam, and I have PyEnv installed in my Python version. I'm using 3.7. And so we'll mostly be going over, Docker build, Docker push, things like that. Yeah, and then we'll actually run pipelines. Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and start? I believe I already activated it, but just in case I didn't. Yeah, cool, we're good. And so I'm actually just going to, before we do that, I'm going to change this to demo time. Output header, cool. And so let's go ahead and run this. And hopefully, pray to the demo gods, this will work. Here we go. My control key is a little stuck right now, just in case you're wondering what was going on just there. Yeah, so this is building my Docker file. We'll let it run for a little bit. It's installing the fun libraries and exporting and pushing. Because I've already pushed some things before, this is a lot faster than it might already be right now. Just as a warning, in case you try this later and you're like, why is this taking so long? It's because the base image is very large. Yeah, awesome. So we have it. If we look at GCR, which I may or may not, well, nope, okay, cool. Let me go and find the URL that I actually did for this. Cool. So if we look, it's up here. It's loading. Awesome. We've pushed it. Hooray. It's accessible. So we'll go ahead then and actually run this on Dataflow Runner. So with Dataflow Runner, we actually, because it runs things primarily using remote file systems, it's not going to be using the input file on the image itself. We're going to be using the one in GCS that is basically the same thing. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and start that. It's going to be running in the background. And hopefully we'll see it. Sorry? I think someone came in and asked a question, but I wasn't sure. I didn't really hear it. If you want to put it in chat while we're waiting for it to start. Yeah, and so now we see it's running. So this is my running job. Just to sort of let you know what it looks like on Cloud Dataflow. you can see that this is actually provided as the pipeline option. So here's where you can go to verify that, this is your image. And so, yeah, you can see that it's using my custom image. We'll wait for this to run. You can follow along by looking at the logs typically. If you have any issues, going to the Logs Explorer and especially run custom containers, we have specific metrics for Docker and for Kubelet, which we actually use to manage all the containers on a worker under the hood. We can maybe go look at that now. Yeah, and so a good way to look at this is actually to look at the different Docker and Kubelet logs that you have right here. This is basically how you would maybe go debug things if things go wrong. If you've used incorrect container image or if something's wrong with the container pool, definitely go look at the Kubelet logs to see what's going on there. That's a good place to start if you're using cloud logging, which by default most people are. This is sort of the boring part. Yeah. So the reason why I'm not going to be showing a local runner unless we have time for it is it's pretty straightforward, but also sort of the experience of it with the containers right now is not great. We are eventually hoping to make it easier to like mount local directories, and so having the ability to do that for the worker process or the SDK harness process is just sort of the next step there. Yeah, awesome. So it seems like it completed nicely. I output everything to a yes, and so you can see my output log added sparkles. Yay! Now, if we go to my bucket, we should be able to see the outputs that I just wrote using my pipeline. Oh, yeah. And yeah, as you can see, it wrote my header and it has all my sparkly word count. You can see whether or not King Lear has special single word usages or prime word usages. Hooray! Yeah, so that's my demo. Going back to the presentation. Oh, yeah. So sort of to finish up, I've kind of skirted over some of these before. But if you are going to use this feature, you should make sure definitely that your SDK type and version matches. Don't, if you're running a Java pipeline, don't use the Beam Python SDK, and make sure that you're using stable versions of Beam if you're building it from source. Make sure that whatever SDK you're running locally, or to write your pipeline and to run your pipeline, to actually launch the job actually matches the SDK on the image. Typically, this shouldn't be an issue because whatever SDK you're running locally will make sure that it has the proper SDK installed on the worker, and so it'll actually just try to go and download it. So It will fail if your worker doesn't have, say, access to the internet or things like that. But or if it's on like a private VPC kind of situation. And make sure that your language version matches. Often this will sort of like appear as like a weird error opcode or some sort of method error. And so make sure that, if you're running Python 3.7 locally, you're running it on, that's like what your container also is running. As we mentioned, local runner and container behavior is a little weird right now. File systems are local to the container, and we basically sort of have to pipe through Docker commands in order to properly mount local file systems. And there have been a couple of PRs around that in the past, and we'll be sort of working on that as like potentially as something in the future to make it easier to run the SDK container image locally. What if I don't want to install Docker? Docker has some issues, especially if you're running in Linux, where you have to have root access. So you give Docker root access, and you run everything as sudo. So you can use other builders, obviously, Canicos or similar sort of things that are more focused on hermetic builds or things like that. And then you can also do things like run it on Cloud Build or run it on some other sort of containerized build system where it actually runs Docker off of the container.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt. Actually, I have a doubt. Actually, I'm learning Apache Beam. So if we are using Python SDK, then can we run it on Apache Fling Runner? Is it possible?
Yeah. You should be able to. I believe. Here, let me. So in my demo script, wrong editor. In my demo script, you can actually say example of running it using just like the basic Flink runner.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's obviously I don't have off the top of my head like a Flink cluster to show you what that looks like. But there's documentation on Beam itself for how to both spin up the Flink server and reference it in the Python runner. The documentation on some pages might be outdated there, and if you see that, you should definitely file an issue or let us know if you see somewhere where it says like Python runner not supported or things like that.
Okay. So because I didn't find a course on this one. I mean, it's really difficult from the official documentation to grasp knowledge on Apache Beam and Apache Fling actually, because I am working on something that I need to build the pipeline on Apache Beam and need to run on Fling Runner. So it's really difficult. Yeah, it was really difficult to find. That's why I'm really looking forward to this. This webinar. Thank you very much for all things. Actually, it's really been helpful for yeah. Continuing. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And so, to sort of go back, the final things to keep in mind are Docker Hub rate limits. They recently instituted a thing where anonymous users, which is most machines, have 100 polls per 6 hours. And so if you're managing your own runners, you might want to set up something to increase that quota, or just don't use Docker Hub to host your own container images, but just keeping that in mind. So particularly if you're running it on your workers on some cloud provider, you probably want to use the related container registry with a cloud provider or something similar. Yeah. And so sort of the next steps, because we're in preview right now for Dataflow, the thing we're sort of thinking about are both like improving messaging around it for, this is further support and launches. So if you see anything weird, and you want to try it out and you see anything that seems weird or unexpected, please let us know. We're hoping to improve the local container testing so you don't have to, log everything. And we'll also hopefully add usability features. This is maybe a back step in terms of like adding more pipeline options for everything. But hopefully what we can do is, given like a simple requirements text, or given, just like a list of artifacts that you want to stage on a container image, we can basically do something where you don't have to run Docker yourself. We will basically build a container for you on the fly right before we launch the pipeline, and then the pipeline will get submitted with that job image. And sort of the benefits of this is that you're not actually, if they're very large files, you aren't actually downloading that new file every time. For example, different workers might be running several different SDK harnesses on them at once. And so typically, if it's actually like, artifacts that you've staged, you have to download that every time you start up a new SDK harness process, which is maybe not ideal. But if it's a container image, it gets pulled once per worker. So if you have sort of ideas about that too, please feel free. There are definitely ways to contact us. You can talk to us on Slack. You can email the user or dev mailing list, things like that. And here's the documentation guides for these features. And so, yeah, I think I want to cut it off here and give you guys some time to ask me questions. I'll definitely be able to stick around for a bit longer. But yeah, I hope this was informative and sort of gave you a basic overview of custom containers.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for that. That was a really great, lots to think about, and very interesting. We have a few questions in the chat, which I can go through for you. The first one from Andrew is a general question. They ask, what is the reason for using Beam rather than sticking with some well-known frameworks like Flink or Spark?
So in general, I think the benefit there is that, I mean, if you're very happy in your own runner, by all means, feel free to continue using it. But, different runners have different benefits. And if you want to try out different features, or if you even just want to like combine sort of, have multi like runner capability, or if you just want to use a feature that's implemented in a different language or things like that, this is sort of a way to we have something upcoming called like cross-language pipelines, which I don't know if it will necessarily apply to Flink or Spark. Actually, that's a pretty new feature to me too, so I might have to go look a little bit more at it. But the idea is that with your when you write your code, you can actually use, for example, we have like the Kafka input connector written in Java that's very robust. But maybe you just want to write your code in Python, and so being able to, use both of those and then have it in a pipeline format that can be then sent to Flink without having to like necessarily change too much about your existing code, if that makes sense. Yeah, so just sort of like the nature of Beam is that it like adds sort of like layers of translation so that it's sort of easier to move from one thing to another.
Okay, great. The next question is from Ismail, who asks, are there many choices for the base image? 900 megabytes is a lot.
Yeah. So this is actually another sort of like usability feature that we are considering, and it's particularly very large right now because of our limitations in like historically have been users don't have the ability to run custom containers. So because so much of our users use TensorFlow, this is really just maybe revealing a little too much. TensorFlow is a very large package. And so that's like the majority of it, honestly, is TensorFlow dependencies. And so with the ability to have custom containers, essentially this allows you then to maybe just for TensorFlow containers, we might start releasing what we call fat images or Uber images, however you want to say it, and slim images, where one wouldn't contain TensorFlow or large numbers of dependencies. And so that's sort of like something we're looking for in the future. So definitely, if you feel strongly about it, please let us know. But yeah, and that sort of like tells us what our priorities are for working on things. But yeah, we definitely know it's a very large image. 3.8, the reason I don't use it right now is because it is even larger. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then we have another question from Ismail again, who asks, the GCP authentication is on the custom Docker image. Can you please elaborate on that?
So the GCP authentication is actually for Dataflow Runner, it's through the VM. You can definitely set application default credentials to a service account key. Everyone does it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. Generally, I think there's a big disconnect between what the IAM team recommends and then what everyone else does. But the reason why I sort of didn't demo it today is primarily because just like internal shenanigans. But basically, I couldn't export a service account key because my org policy doesn't allow me to, so I can't show you. Yeah, that's it. But basically, the ideal situation is that for things that require credentials, you actually are using the base worker to do it. And so, but for example, if you wanted to say access something in AWS from the GCP worker running in Dataflow, you can definitely set up all of the secret keys and things like that. If that makes sense to you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then Kobe asks, the previous Beam has the option SDK harness container image overrides, which only exists in Dataflow Runner. Here, the environment config work harness container image are the same, or is it different?
So they are pretty similar. SDK harness container image overrides and worker harness container image are actually quite similar flags. There's, I think, sort of a movement maybe to actually move towards SDK harness container image overrides, but I think right now we're sticking with worker harness container image. Typically that's like what we use, but I don't quite remember the syntax for SDK harness container image overrides, but it's pretty similar, and using both should be fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Rashid asks if there will be a recording of this. I will have to speak to my colleagues after this to talk about if and how it will be released. We are recording it, so we will let you know after this session, if and how we will release the recording. But Alberto asks about the links that you have in your presentation. Can you post them in the chat window or share the deck slides just so people can have access to these guides?
I will go ahead and do that actually. I'm not actually sure if I can make this public. I will go ahead and figure that out, and maybe we will sort of send that out later. Yeah, we will try to get these to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So then that's a comment from Joe. Kobe asks a follow-up question. When using the custom container and when providing the own, when do you use the custom container and when to provide your own expansion services for Xlang transform?
I guess I'm not super sure about the Xlang stuff, but you should be able to provide your own ST. I guess, is this sort of like asking if you can use custom containers with Xlang, or is this yeah,
No.
yeah,
Kobe, if you want to, I don't know, clarify, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah. Ideally, with custom or with Xlang, there will be the ability to run this with custom containers, where essentially when you define your containers, it typically looks like you define one per like language that you want to use, and so basically providing a different URL there instead of what you're currently using.
Okay. Kobe is typing, so
yeah.
I should say while we wait, as this is a meetup, when these more formal questions are done, what we can do is I'll turn the recording off, and then if people want to hang around for a bit and switch their cameras and their mics on and have a more informal discussion, then that will be possible too. Oh yeah, and don't forget that the Beam College is taking place soon. So it starts on April the 7th. It's free. You can register at beamcollege.dev. It's a great place to learn from experts. It's very flexible because it's 5 one-day webinar sessions as well. So yeah, definitely check that out. Okay, Kobe says they can't unmute, but that's fine. Thank you. So if there are no more questions in the chat, then I would say thank you so much, Emily, for that. That was really great. Yeah, really great session. Yes, we will be hosting another meetup like this next month, so we'll be letting people know about that shortly. So stay tuned and yeah, look out for that. And yeah, the Beam College is coming up. But yeah, thank you once again.